Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Bible talk for today. It's Wednesday, and it's a lovely sunny day. And thank you so much for joining us for our talk for today. Just to remind you, as I do occasionally, don't forget to share these messages with your friends so others can enjoy them too. Friends, Luke chapter 2, it's all happening, isn't it? So just to remind you what's happened so far in this chapter, you have Mary and Joseph who were sort of living in Nazareth, which is in the north by Galilee. And then they travelled the 100 miles south to Bethlehem, because that's where Joseph's and Mary's family come from, where Mary gives birth in Bethlehem. When Jesus is about 40 days old, they travel to Jerusalem, which isn't very far away, for the purification, which is what we heard about yesterday with Simeon and Anna and all that sort of stuff. And then when that's finished, they travel the 100 miles back up north again to Galilee, to Nazareth, where Jesus is brought up. Go on about 12 years, you get Jesus' bar mitzvah, which happens in our reading for today. So without further ado, Luke and chapter 2, and I'm starting to read at verse 41. Here goes. Now every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travellers, they went a day's journey. And they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they didn't find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all that heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they didn't understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favour. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, this is an intriguing passage, say from the beginning, for essentially for three reasons. Firstly, from Jesus being about 2 to about 30, this is the only thing that we hear about the childhood of Jesus. We know he's brought up in Nazareth, we know his father was a carpenter, but this is the only incident that we hear between Jesus being about 2 or something and him being about 30. And people have speculated all sorts of things about this, and who knows? I mean, it could be that, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John just didn't know much about it. Maybe there weren't many stories about it. Maybe they just didn't think it was important. Maybe they essentially Matthew, Mark, Luke and John wanted to persuade people that Jesus is the Messiah, and I guess they perhaps didn't think there was anything in his childhood that was particularly noteworthy, given that time and papyrus was short or whatever. Maybe that's what they just chose to focus on. But remember that Mark and John start the life of Jesus with him being at 30. Matthew mentions the Christmas, but with the wise men. Luke has it with just the shepherds. But as I say, apart from Matthew and Luke mentioning his birth, we hear nothing else apart from this story between Jesus being about 2 and about 30. We could speculate, but we don't know. The second thing which I think is intriguing about this story is, of course, in the story we hear the first recorded words of Jesus, because from when he was about, when he was knee-high to grasshopper, when he was a bab, as they say in the Black Country, he didn't say anything, did he? So the words here, "Didn't you know I'd be in my Father's house," are actually the first recorded words we have out of the mouth of Jesus. I just think it's quite interesting. You get these, you can get Bibles with the words of Jesus in red. And this would be the first ones in red that you hear in the Gospels. So these are the first recorded words of Jesus. I think the other thing to say, though, is, isn't this every parent's nightmare? Losing your child. I mean, honestly, it's every parent's nightmare, isn't it? Sometimes with some kids or whatever, you wonder how they make it to adulthood. But this is, as I say, every parent's nightmare. His parents have gone on this trip to Jerusalem, and they've come back. They've probably travelled about 25 miles, and the sudden res, they thought their child was with all the other children, because that's kind of what happened. They realise he isn't, so they go back, and you can imagine it must have been the longest day of their lives. And then they search around the city, and because they find him, But as I say, this is every parent's nightmare, isn't it? The thought of losing your child in a city. Ugh. But it's what happened to Mary and Joseph here. But what can we learn from this? What is this passage trying to tell us? I think the first thing it's telling us, like I said yesterday, is that Mary and Joseph were good religious parents. You know, they did it. They did it right. You know, he was circumcised at 8 days old. He was dead. You know, he was the purification was done at 40 days old or whatever. And here every year we hear them making the 100 miles travel. And bear in mind, of course, it was before the days of planes, trains, and automobiles. It would have been on the back of a donkey or walked or whatever. They did the 100-mile trip every year to Jerusalem. These were good parents. So Jesus came from good religious stock. He was properly brought up. They weren't particularly rich people. They weren't particularly famous or anything like that at the time. But for all Mary and Joseph, you've got to recognise here, were good parents. They brought their child up with all the kind of rituals and customs that good Jewish families do. So the Messiah came from good religious stock, okay, and he was brought up properly in the faith, properly. So the first thing you got to hear is that Mary and Joseph were good parents, and they clearly cared about Jesus. They were worried when they thought they'd lost him and so on. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Jesus was a good boy. I mean, come back to what happened just in a minute, but it's quite clear at the end that Jesus submitted to them. That despite being the Son of God, and despite being the second person of the Trinity, and despite being all his credentials of being the Messiah and so on, he was a good boy, and he allowed himself to be under the authority of his parents. He submitted, and he grew in stature with God, with humans, and with God, and so on. He obviously learned a trade, and he learned obedience to his parents. So his parents were good parents, but Jesus was a good boy too, and I think we need to recognise that and this what happened here wasn't some teenage strop. He wasn't being naughty. He wasn't running away. He was a good boy. So what ultimately happened in Jerusalem, and how can we square Jesus being a good boy with what happened in Jerusalem? I think it's because we have to recognise that whilst he was a good boy, whilst he was a good, obedient son, his first call in his life was God. And that much as he was a good, obedient son, he was more obedient to his heavenly Father than he was even to his earthly parents. And that he loved God first. And, he had to be in his Father. And therefore, I don't think he thought he was being disobedient. I think he thought what he was doing was blindingly what he should have been doing, because he was in his Father's house and astonishing people with the questions he was asking and that type of stuff. So he wasn't being a bad son, in a sense. He was demonstrating that in his life, God came first. And I think there's a reminder for us, really, of this, is that God needs to come first for us too. And there have been some great heroes through history. One of my favourite stories is the story of Thomas More, the great what was he, Chancellor or something, and Henry VIII. He was a very devout man, and at the point of just before he was executed, he said, "I remain the king's servant, but God's first." He was a friend of the king. He was a servant of the king. He was a loyal servant of the king, but ultimately God came first in his life. And I think it's the same thing, with I love my country, but I unashamedly love God first. And actually God has to come first in our lives. And I think here, Jesus was a good son. He was a good, obedient son to Mary and Joseph, brought up properly, I say, good, obedient son. But for all that, God came first in his life. Didn't you know that I'd be in my Father's house? So what can we learn from this morning's reading? First is that Jesus came from good Jewish stock. He was brought up as his parents did it properly. They did all the things they're supposed to. Jesus was brought up, as I say, from a good Jewish home with all the trimmings. Secondly, that he was a good and obedient son. But thirdly, that what happened in the temple here was not Jesus being disobedient. It was just Jesus being obedient to the one who had a higher authority even than his parents, which of course was God himself, and demonstrating the fact that he was the Son of God, and therefore God's house is exactly where he's going to be, isn't it? And that we likewise need to put God first in our lives too. Hope that makes sense. God bless you. Enjoy the